Hello and welcome. I'm Ivan Sandoval, Customer Service Manager at the King County Clerk's Office and also a member of the King County Superior Courts and Community Committee. As the committee celebrates this year's Latinx Hispanic Heritage Month, we also thank you for joining us in this event to celebrate the various achievements, successes, rich histories, contributions, and diverse cultures of the American Latinx Hispanic communities in the United States. The King County Superior Courts and Community Committee is fully dedicated to promoting public understanding of the justice system and eliminating barriers to equity and social justice. We do our work through public presentations, seminars, events, and other programs and activities. Today, in honor of the Latinx Hispanic Heritage Month, we have with us Judge Michael Diaz, Judge Veronica Galván, and Judge Mafé Rajul, three Latinx Hispanic King County Washington Superior Court judges, interviewing one another about their heritage and other influences impacting Latinx Hispanic cultures and communities, including equitable access to justice. Let's remember that this year's theme of the Latinx celebration is Esperanza, translating to hope. The theme invites us to reflect on how amazing our future can be if we hold onto our resilience and hope. It allows us to reflect on all of the contributions and successes of the Latinx Hispanic have made throughout history and will continue to make in a brighter future. Esperanza also reminds us that we are stronger together. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. However, before we start, I want to share some, let's see here. Okay, let's see, okay, the webinar etiquette. So be respectful, ask questions, feel free to ask questions throughout the Q&A function. Reminder, judges cannot provide legal advice or talk about their cases. And we also encourage you to have fun and enjoy the event. Please, again, feel free to ask judges questions that come to mind. Also, King County Superior Courts and community events can be found on our website. Here's our website, or you can just Google King County Superior Court, log into the main page, and then search from inside that website community events, and then it will take you to our main page. We have almost every month events, virtual events or activities that the public or our partners can join at any time. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and please have fun and feel free to ask questions. So thank you. I'll turn it over to the judges. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Ivan. I guess I'll kick us off just real briefly and just thank everybody. It's a great turnout. I think we have 69 participants, attendees. So thank you, 63 attendees. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Mike Diaz, and you're looking at the three Latinx judges on the King County Superior Court. This is it. 54 we have 54 judges total, and you're looking at the three. And I think we represent maybe half, a third maybe, of all the Latinx Superior Court judges around the state. I'm looking to Judge Galván a little bit, who's more clued in with that. But
Well, I can tell you there's a lot more than there were 5 years ago. So, I was very lonely for a very long time, so I'm very grateful for the people that I have with me now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is what we kind of envisioned is just a real informal conversation type between us three, get to know one another a little bit better, get to know, and thereby you guys can get to know us a little bit better too. And so we were just gonna, like Ivan said, just kind of start asking us each other questions, kind of framed around two big topics. The first one being raíces, which is, our roots, kind of where we come from, what we're, at our deepest selves all about. And then some of the work that has been done in access to justice, with a Latinx lens. So I'm going to kick it off by asking Judge Galván a little bit about her raíces. Judge Galván, you were born in Bremerton, but you grew up in the Yakima Valley. So you want to help us unpack that a little bit?
So yes, my grandmother, I'm a third generation American on my mom's side, but first generation on my father's. So my family has been in the Yakima Valley since the 40s. Prior to that, my great grandparents were from Mexico and had immigrated to Texas. And then from Texas, they followed the cosecha, as we say, all the way to Washington State and eventually settled here in Washington, where they worked hops, cherries, apples, etc. So my mother was born and raised in Toppenish, and I was born in Bremerton, but grew up back in Toppenish and then eventually to the Tri-Cities. And so I'm at least a second generation Washingtonian. So very deep roots, particularly in the Valley, and a lot of my family is still there. So because my father was from Mexico, I do speak Spanish. I will note that my mother did not grow up fluent in Spanish, although her father was from Mexico. He was very strict about what language you spoke, and if you did not speak it correctly, you shouldn't be speaking it. It was rather funny now that I think about it. But we used to travel to Mexico and come back here. So every other year, I'd live a year in Mexico and a year here. So I grew up and spent a lot of my formative years in Chihuahua, which is where my father was from. So those are kind of my stories. My father also picked fruit and worked in the hop fields and the apples and the cherries. And so that was where I came from.
Wonderful. Can I follow up on that a little bit? And Judge Rajul, you should jump in too if you have follow-up questions. So Chihuahua, that's northern Mexico, is that right?
Yeah.
Northern Mexico. And did he have a big family in Chihuahua?
Yes. So my father was one of 9. My mother is the eldest of 13.
Oh, wow.
So I have over 60 some odd first cousins. So when people talk about, oh, we had a big dinner, there was 10 of us, I'm like, that's Sunday night at my house. And I still literally live, my sister currently lives 3 blocks south of me. And my brother lives 2 blocks west of me. So we live in a little triangle. So I only have 2 siblings, but yeah, we are all very, very close.
The language thing also really interests me because I think it's something that a lot of Latinx people have different experiences with. You know, you can't assume. And so like your mom, for example, right, growing up in the Valley and learning to speak Spanish maybe through your dad, is that what it was kind of, did her Spanish improve through your dad, her husband?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's so funny because I think other people don't necessarily have to answer that question, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we're 3 generations in and people still wonder why or if we speak Spanish. I don't see some of my colleagues being asked if they speak Gaelic if they have an Irish sounding last name. And it's not like that's the expectation, right? There is this, and we get it from both sides. So our own community expects us to speak Spanish, even if we've been here for 9 or 10 generations. You know, we have people who didn't cross the border literally crossed them because they've been here since certain states were part of Mexico. And yet there's this expectation that somehow we still have to maintain the language because it's so interlaced with the culture. At least that's how I feel being Mexican. I don't know. I'm going to ask you guys now. Judge Diaz, you're from Peru. Judge Rajul, you grew up in Colombia. How do you feel about that?
Well, my story is a little bit different. I grew up in Colombia and I moved to the United States when I was 17, wanting to learn English. So I grew up speaking Spanish in Colombia and my native language is Spanish. So for me, it's a little bit different, but I can tell you that when I speak with my cousins who live here in the States and they have children, they have made it almost a rule, especially when nowadays, more than in the old days, that they speak Spanish at the house, and then at school the kids will learn English. And the reason for that is twofold. One is because they want their kids to be bilingual in order to have more opportunities later on, but also because they don't want their kids to lose that root and that connection with their culture. And so if they go back to Colombia, they want their kids to feel just like if they had grown up there. So, and for me, I came here and after I learned English, the first job I wanted to get once I felt that I was fluent was a job where I could use both my Spanish and my English, because I wanted to be able to speak both languages. And that's how I became an interpreter.
What about you, Judge Diaz?
The relationship with language is super complicated, I think. There's so many layers to it. I think Judge Galván rightly identifies the kind of the outward, more general cultural layer, the one where, and it's not just with respect to the majority culture, right? It's not just with respect to Caucasians or white people when you're out in community, what they expect from you, but it's also even within the Latino community too. If somebody knows my title or position and then they hear me speak Spanish, they're often surprised and also excited, right? They don't sometimes, and there's a lot of assumptions built in there. But there's always this kind of testing of the waters a little bit, like, okay, so where are you on this language spectrum? And once you kind of open up that space for somebody, it really, I think, can be a very positive moment. You can really, and this is whether it's Latinx people or not, and you can show that you share that language and those experiences with other people. And it's actually an opportunity to bring people into your circle and become more intimate in that way. That is different from what expectations there are within your family, for example. So I was born in Peru. We all immigrated, a whole mess of us immigrated to Seattle when I was an infant. My mom was one of 12. My dad was one of 7. I, like you, Judge Galván, have 60 plus first cousins and another 30 plus second cousins, and mostly living in Seattle. And the variety of experiences on the language side vary completely, and even within my mom's family. So my mom and maybe a younger sibling or 2 and above, English is clearly not their first language, right? But then you go down into younger siblings, some of my younger aunts and uncles, and English is essentially their first language. I mean, they came when they were 10, 11, 12 or so, but they pretty much dominated the language. And so the relationship with the language is different. So with my older uncles and aunts, I'll speak in Spanish almost exclusively. With my younger uncles and aunts, I'll speak, kind of Spanglishy or Englishy. And it kind of goes same with my cousins, the older cousins, the ones who immigrated here or, grew up with parents who spoke Spanish exclusively. We all know that we all speak Spanish, but our younger cousins don't as much as frequently. And there's all sorts of layers to that too. Some of them, just because they didn't think about it, they didn't emphasize it, but others really did, and they really are trying. And so it really is a full spectrum on every individual person. And I think ultimately too, for me at least, the other layer of this is it's kind of personal confidence, personal preference. I think you Judge Rajul and you Judge Galván, your guys' Spanish is better than mine, for example. I have an accent, I have an American accent when I speak in it. I didn't take Spanish classes as a kid growing up. It wasn't until college where I took a class called Spanish for Near Native Speakers that I learned any grammar of any kind. It was all very much just home Spanish, the basics, and there were a million different areas where I didn't know the appropriate words in Spanish. And so I think for me personally, sometimes I'm kind of shy about using my Spanish. So, and some days I'll have a lot of confidence and we'll do television interviews in Spanish. And other days I'm like a little less confident and I'll be a little bit more quiet, and so it really ranges the full spectrum. And I think though, ultimately, if you approach it from an open spirit and a curiosity, most people, the vast majority, respond in a positive way. So that's been my experience. And that cuts across Latinx people of all generations and white people of all generations. And And so I think it should be something that binds us, because that's what binds us, not something that separates us, hopefully.
So
those are
two
my-
things
Yeah.
that I would like to say in response to that. One is I have an English accent when I speak. I'm sorry, yeah, Spanish accent when I speak in English. I can tell that I have an accent. So don't worry about having an accent, because I know I will never really get rid of my accent. The other thing that I wanted to share from a professional perspective, with me speaking Spanish and really wanted to get back once I learned English, and I really wanted to get back into a profession where I was able to speak Spanish, is that, of course, I enjoyed being an interpreter, connecting with people, in part because it was connecting with somebody from my culture, even though they were not from Colombia. And parentheses, one thing that Ivan said that I love was that together we can achieve more and have the hope of standing together. And I felt that as an interpreter, I was able to meet people from so many different places, from Mexico, from Puerto Rico, from Venezuela, both as colleagues, but also as I was interpreting. But then when I was a prosecutor, it was very fulfilling for me, and it brought me great satisfaction when I would have a victim that was reluctant to testify or cooperate with the police because they were afraid. They mistrusted the system. They were concerned they were going to get turned over to immigration if they didn't have a citizenship, or they were not here legally. They were concerned of a lot of different things. And they were also concerned they were not going to be understood. And being able to speak with that victim Spanish and not through an interpreter gave me a great sense of satisfaction. And I felt that the victims and the witnesses in my cases when I was a prosecutor gave me a different level of trust that this just made it so much more rewarding. So I just wanted to add that piece on the language issue professionally. And of course, now being the chair of the Interpreter Commission, it has been great to be able to bring some of those experiences that I had as a non-English speaker when I got here, and then an interpreter, and then a prosecutor dealing with Spanish-speaking people, both in my role as a prosecutor and when I had to use an interpreter when I was in court, and now a judge. So it has also been great to address that and see some of the advances and some of the improvements that we have made with respect to language access here in the United States. Well, not the United States, in Washington. Not the United States, Washington.
So my experience was, oh, sorry, Judge Rajul.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say my experience was similar to yours in that I also used Spanish, particularly in court. I allowed people to have essentially mitigate infractions in Spanish. And that, I feel the same way you did. It was so amazing to see people's faces when they knew that they had access to the courts, and that the person who was going to be making this monumental decision about, this incident was able to understand what they were saying.
Absolutely, I agree. And even moving a little bit beyond just a language thing, I think there are all these, and it's hard to quantify and hard to really put your finger on sometimes, but there are certain kind of cultural similarities across these cultures, so that when you have a litigant come in, they understand, and there's kind of a feeling of trust when they walk in, and there's a way of their discussing things, and there's maybe structures in their lives that you can understand, and experiences that they've gone through, so that there's a little bit less explaining, and a little bit more trust as they're walking in. Which I think is very helpful, obviously, as a decision maker.
When I was an interpreter, I had a lot of friends that were defense attorneys, and more than prosecutors, actually. And when I went to law school, they all assumed that I was going to be a defense attorney. And they said, well, why aren't you going to be a defense attorney and work with the defendants that speak Spanish? And I said, well, for two reasons. One is there are also Spanish-speaking victims, not just defendants. So we have it on both spectrums. And second, at the time, all of the Spanish-speaking attorneys that I knew that worked in the criminal justice system were defense attorneys. And I thought, if I come as a defendant, a non-English speaker, and the only person, and across the system, I see that the only person that speaks Spanish is my defense attorney, but you don't have judges that are Spanish speakers. You don't have prosecutors that are Spanish speakers. What does that tell me? And I felt that it was important to have that, that diversity, not just with the defense bar, but across the entire system. For the same reason that you were saying, is the trust aspect of it. And at the time, I don't think Judge Martinez was already in federal court. So he wasn't even in King County Superior Court at the time. And Justice Gonzalez was not in our Superior Court either. So the only Spanish-speaking people that you would see were the defense attorneys. Although Judge Galván, you were a prosecutor in the city, for the city.
Yes.
So why did you
And
try to be a prosecutor instead of a defense attorney?
Why did I? Because, you know, when I was in college, I actually interned for the public defender's office. I knew I wanted to do criminal law, and I interned for the public defender's office. And there was two situations which really made me want to be a prosecutor. The first situation, I was asked to interview the victim, a young woman who had been raped. And I went to interview this young woman in her home. And this young woman, who had, by all accounts, been a very gregarious and outgoing and energetic young woman, was now living in her room with the shades of the windows covered with blankets. And it was a very difficult situation. And my whole role was to try to find holes in her story. And this was a very extraordinarily traumatized young woman. And I was not exactly comfortable within that role. The second thing that made me want to be a prosecutor is actually a situation in which a Spanish-speaking individual was charged with assault. The injuries were on a security guard from a store. The injuries on the security guard were the knuckles were bloody from where the security guard had beaten this gentleman for allegedly taking one of those disposable cameras. By all accounts, apparently he was trying to return one. That's what his wife said, but they could not speak English and they had difficulty communicating with the police. And so they weren't able to tell their side or their version of the events. But the idea that anybody would charge somebody who was clearly severely injured and would call these injuries was so offensive to me that it really made me think that we needed people with a different perspective as a prosecutor, because we need those lenses. I think if people are going to have faith in their systems, you need people who bring different experiences and different lenses. No one lens is perfect. And the more eyes you have on it, the more perspectives that you have on it, I think the better decisions are made. And so I realized pretty quickly that the people who had the ability to use discretion to make these monumental decisions that are often life or death, and who perhaps didn't understand or consider some of these other underlying issues, needed to be in those positions of power. So for me, that was important. But Judge Diaz, you went a whole different route. You went into civil law, correct?
I did, yeah, right. Right after law school, I was extraordinarily in debt, and was really unsure what I wanted to do with my life. I think maybe like you two, I didn't know a lawyer until I went to law school. I mean, literally, let alone a judge or anybody else involved in the legal system. I knew that I wanted to do public service in some way, but I didn't know what. And that's why I admire so much what Judge Galván and others on the court do when they do youth and law forums and really expose kids to all the different ways that you can serve your community, because that's not something I benefited from. That said, I also knew I wanted to, be trained really well and kind of try to be a lawyer's lawyer kind of deal. And so combination of reasons, went to private practice for about 6 years. But on day one, I was across the desk on an antitrust case from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. They were doing a big shipping collusion case where oil companies were colluding to fix prices in the oil shipping market. And I thought to myself, why am I not on that side of the desk? Why am I on this side of the desk? And so, and little by little, was lucky enough to get these opportunities where I was on the other side of all these great U.S. attorneys' offices. And so when I was able finally to be in a position to move my family and I back to Seattle, I applied immediately to the U.S. Attorney's Office and eventually got a position there. And then eventually was able, after a couple of years there, to really be dedicated to enforcing civil rights laws on the civil side. So housing discrimination, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, and then our most significant case while I was there, at least the most high profile, was the Seattle police case involving the consent decree, where we investigated and brought a lawsuit which we settled involving the Seattle Police Department to remedy some of their unconstitutional practices earlier in the last decade. And so again, it was one of those things where I didn't know how I could serve, but all these little experiences were lucky enough to set me up for that position. And where, again, going back to the Latinx portion of this, where, we were able to do our investigations with the assistance of El Centro de la Raza. We set up interviews there. We conducted interviews in Spanish. We then, when we announced findings, we were able to do it in multiple languages. We had a, separate from the police case, we had a language access case. We've had lots of those, but one including involving our own court, where we got complaints from interpreters like Judge Rajul used to be, that our court wasn't providing interpreter services in civil cases. And there were a lot of good reasons that the court had for being concerned about providing those. And we eventually reached a good resolution there. But again, it's like you have these values, you have these experiences, and then you just hope that you're lucky enough to be put in a position where you can use those values and those experiences. So that was kind of my deal. It wasn't one big thing or one overwhelming scenario, but just kind of accumulation of separate events. I have one question for you, Judge Galván, too, going back. When you were thinking about what kind of path you wanted to take, were there any particular professional influences or mentors that you had that really assisted you? Because I think like a lot of us, there weren't a lot of Latino lawyers out there at the time. There weren't a lot of Latino judges. There weren't, and it doesn't have to just be a Latino or Latino mentor, but any mentors or professional influences that were really important to you then when you were deciding these things?
Absolutely. You mentioned Judge Ricardo Martinez. I was a freshman in college when he was appointed to the King County Superior Court bench. And I went to school in Bellingham, and he's from that area. His family's in that area. And there was an organization called the Whatcom Hispanic Organization that celebrated his appointment and held a party for him. And I met him when I was a freshman in college. And he was and has always been an extraordinary mentor to me. In law school, Justice Gonzalez was he was a practicing attorney when I started law school, and he was assigned to be my mentor. And so I met him my first year of law school as well. I had some mentors, BIPOC mentors, white mentors. There was a gentleman in Pasco who owned a newspaper, and he would let me write stories for him when I was in high school. And they didn't just mentor me. I mean, the people in the Whatcom Hispanic Organization, they basically adopted me. These were the people who would feed me, make sure that during finals I had care packages, because my parents couldn't come up a lot. They were financially strapped, and these folks raised money to help me pay tuition. And, they gave me a $2,500 scholarship. And it was people like that who welcomed me, a community who welcomed me. And it becomes not the family that you're born into, but somehow the family that you choose or that chooses you. And I think, mentors, I have a lot of mentors, from people who wash dishes for a living to people who became judges for a living and so forth. And all of them have taught me invaluable lessons. And I think, and I appreciate that. And so for me, the things that I do, it's not to pay anyone back, but it's because I need to pay forward everything that they did for me. And that's kind of the philosophy that I take. But, and I know I'm a bit older than the both of you, well, than you guys, but what about you? Who are your mentors, heroes? Judge Diaz?
You know, I like the way you Judge Galván, zoomed out from kind of specific kind of legal, you know, people who are specifically involved in the legal community, and having that kind of narrow mentor. You know, because when we got here, you know, we moved around a good amount at first. You know, we lived in Linwood, we lived down in Beacon Hill, we moved around, but we eventually settled first during elementary school in Ballard, and then eventually for junior high and high school in White Center, Burien area. And those are two different experiences, but I will say that one common one, and I'm not going to idealize it or anything, but one common one was they were both very welcoming communities in their own way. You know, I was the only Latino kid in elementary school, except for one kid, Carlos Echeverry, whose family was, they kind of traveled around a good amount. So he was there for like 6 months in grade school, but, you know, but I was never subjected to, you know, overt forms of discrimination. I mean, we can just talk about other types of discrimination, but for the most part, that community was very welcoming. And it was, the community in Ballard was very welcoming and was very supportive, you know, and of my family, helping us, you know, academically and all the other ways to get acclimated. Always very inclusive, you know, invited to all the parties, invited to all the stuff, so that we felt like we were part of something bigger than, of course, we had a very large family supporting us too, but something bigger than just family. And then the experience down in White Center was also different. It was just, I grew up with Laotians and Cambodians and Vietnamese immigrants and refugees, and it was a different kind of welcoming. It was like, you know, we're kind of all in this together kind of welcoming. And again, I'm not going to idealize either situation. There were a lot of challenges economically, linguistically, but I do see those as mentoring. And I'm just so very grateful to having those communities that you step into, whatever it is, you know, and people opening their homes and their hearts to you is so important. If it had been otherwise, you know, who knows what me and my 5 siblings would have, what kind of experience we would have had. But then finally, I mean, for purposes of the law, you know, I had a lot of I worked with a lot of great lawyers. And I was just super lucky to be trained by a lot of great lawyers over the years. And then when I really started thinking about being a judge, you know, I reached out to you, Judge Galván, for example, early on. It was 7 years ago. I reached out to you. I'd never met you, and you were so kind and always so willing to meet, give me your references, give me other people I should talk to. You know, when I was finally appointed, and you know, you talked to me about what it's like to run, and worked on my stump speech with me and improved things, and all those little things are so innumerable that it's kind of hard to identify just one thing. But those are the kind of people I think about who support and continue to support me in this journey we're on. So, Judge Rajul.
Well, so I moved here by myself, and I didn't know anybody. I came to the Evergreen State College just wanting to learn English as a foreign student. And I just, by luck of people that I met, I kept bouncing from place to place, and I was lucky to meet people that were also welcoming and that were encouraging. But when I moved here, I did not, first of all, I didn't come here thinking I was going to stay. My plan was to come here, learn English, and go back to Colombia and be a marine biologist. If you would have ever asked me when I was in high school if I ever thought about being a lawyer, I would have laughed at your face, because there is no way that I ever consider law or anything related to law. I wanted to be in the water. I wanted to be investigating the animals. The water is just, it was my passion. And I just feel that throughout my life, I have come to certain times where opportunities have just come up and I have just gone for them. And throughout those times, I have met people that have helped me by just believing in me. And when I look back, I think that the person that really taught me that was my mom, because I'm an only child. My dad died when I was 7, and my mom had a bookstore. My dad had a bookstore in Bogota. And when he died, my mom had never run a business, had never worked in the bookstore, didn't know anything. And she all of a sudden became responsible for this business and for taking care of this kid that was not an easy kid to deal with. And so people told her, just sell the bookstore and go and become a secretary somewhere. Sell it and do something else. You're gonna fail. And she didn't. And I always remember that. And she was a great example in that sense, in that she didn't let obstacles stop her. And she didn't let people putting her down stop her. That gave her like more incentive to succeed and to make it. So I first came here, wanted to learn English, decided to stay, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I still thought I was going to be a marine biologist, but I started just taking English classes and I was working. And then all of a sudden I thought, okay, now I'm bilingual, so I want to do something with Spanish. And I went to El Centro de la Raza to look for a job where they needed Spanish-speaking people. And back then in 1991, there were not a lot of Spanish-speaking people in the area. And so I got a job with being a legal secretary, receptionist for an attorney that did medical malpractice. And he didn't speak any Spanish, and most of his clients were Latinos from California. So I started corresponding with the people in California and I would help them. And then I thought, maybe something with the courts would be interesting. But again, I don't want to be a lawyer and I can't afford to be a lawyer. Like, how am I going to do this? And I remember one day just kind of talking with a friend of mine that I had met when I moved here. It's like, yeah, it would be kind of nice to do something in the legal field. And she's like, well, why don't you become an interpreter? And I'm like, oh, an interpreter, that would be good. I think I speak enough English now that I can be an interpreter. I have been working for this attorney. So then I became an interpreter, still thinking that I don't know what I was going to do. Eventually be a marine biologist. So I became an interpreter. And then I thought, my mom kept telling me you should study computer science. The future is in computer science. And I'm like, okay. So I started taking classes for computer science and computer engineering, because by now I realized that I was not going to be the next Mrs. Cousteau, and I did not want to be studying the whales in the cold Puget Sound. I wanted to be in the tropics. So I thought I'm just going to go computer science. And then through my work as an interpreter, as a court interpreter, I realized I really want to be a lawyer. And I met a woman when I was working as an interpreter that is one of my best friends. And I thought, maybe I want to be a lawyer, but again, how am I going to pay for that? And she really encouraged me. And she said, you can find ways. You would be a fantastic lawyer. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess I will do that. And then, so it's always been, again, just chances and things that have presented my way. I didn't have this path. And throughout this journey, I have had the chance to meet people at the right time that were completely new to me, that really stepped out and helped me. And that was true when I became a lawyer, and that was true when I became a judge, and probably a lot more when I became a judge. Just like you mentioned, I spoke with Judge Galván pretty early on. I did know Judge Galván from before, and I spoke with Justice Gonzalez, who really helped me a lot and encouraged me a lot, and so Justice Yu. And I remember one of the first people that I spoke with was Justice Yu. And I told her, I'm thinking about maybe becoming a judge, but I just don't know that I'm the right person for it. And she's like, what do you mean you're not the right person for it? And she really encouraged me. And then after that, I spoke with Justice Gonzalez. And then, of course, Once I started speaking with judges on the bench who knew me from my time as a prosecutor, they started introducing me to other people, including you, Judge Diaz, when Roger Rogoff introduced us. And I felt a great deal of support. And I have to tell you, it was very humbling because I was not expecting that much support. I really didn't. I was scared to pick up the phone. I was scared to send that initial email. I was afraid of rejection, and the amount of support that I received and that I found was very, very humbling and very overwhelming. And I think a lot of it was just also my own insecurity. I remember the first time that I had a jury trial as an interpreter, thinking, I'm speaking in English. I'm arguing in front of a jury in the United States in English. And I had the same feeling when I was a judge. My first trial, I thought, how am I here? How can it be? Am I going to wake up tomorrow and realize that this was a big dream, that this never really happened? And it would have never happened had people not believed in me along the way. So that's a long answer to your question.
No, it's great. It's great. You know, we're starting to look like we're going to start running out of time. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, you know, at least like 10 minutes for questions. But I wanted to circle back a little bit on the Raices part of this, which, you know, we're going into the holiday season now. And I wonder, Judge Rajul, Judge Galván, what are some of your favorite holidays? It doesn't have to be this part of the year necessarily, but what are some of your favorite holidays from your culture, and what are you looking forward to most here?
For me, you know, we've never in my family, because most of my family's from the north, Dia de los Muertos was not so big. But as I've learned more and more about it, and my grandmother, who was from central Mexico, celebrated it. And now that I'm learning more about it, it has become one, and my son's birthday is on that day, so it has become one of my favorite holidays.
For me, it's New Year's Eve. We always had a big party in Colombia. Of course, we always have an excuse to party in Colombia, but it was like that new beginning, and you get together with your friends and your family. It was a big party. And, you know, I think every day is a new day, and every day is a new year, and every day is a new opportunity. But there's something about that new year that has a significance to me of, okay, so what am I going to do this year? How am I going to improve? And that to me has always just been my favorite holiday for that reason. What about you, Judge Diaz?
So I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to pick two. One is Christmas for us. So we celebrate, when I was a kid, we don't celebrate Christmas Day almost at all in Peru. It's all Christmas Eve. And what we do is you jam into somebody's house, you know, literally 70, 80 people in a house. And the kids, you have a giant meal, listen to music, dance, and everybody stays up until midnight. And it's at midnight where everybody opens up all the presents. So you have kids who are just bonkers, sugared up, running around, and then they get to tear into their presents, and then you pass out afterwards in some random room in the house, and your parents keep singing and dancing for about another hour or two, and then so by the time you get home, you know, you're sleeping in until 11 or 12. We would go to Chinese food and go see a movie, much like some other cultures would do on Christmas Day. So that's number one. I love that as a kid. And then number two was, it's actually coming up soon, which is Señor de los Milagros, another religious holiday, a Peruvian festival where we're celebrating, you know, just surviving an earthquake 400 years ago that wiped out most of Lima. And there's music and processions and food, and there's a lot of processing in Peru. Seems like everything we do, we start marching around. Not sure why, but that's fun, and everybody dresses up in purple. So, and when I was a kid, people would confuse us with like Husky fans, but we're actually dressed up in purple for religious reasons. So that was fun. So those are some of my holidays. But I want to ask a couple follow-up questions. So what is, Judge Galvan, how do you celebrate Dia de los Muertos? What do you do? Like, what does that day look like?
We have Pan de Muertos, and we honor and sit down around and have drinks and food and talk about those that have gone before us, and remember who we are through them, and what we represent through them, what we have through them. I did want to address a question in the chat. How does your cultural background influence your judicial decision making, if it does? And I don't know if we're different than anybody else. I think everybody has life experiences and lived experiences that whatever issues come before them are filtered through those lenses. So it's not necessarily about our cultural background, it's about our lived experiences, because as Latinos, we've all had varying different cultural backgrounds. They're not the same. And you know, there's even if we share a language, even if the language and can be challenging. When I learned this as somebody whose in-laws were Puerto Rican, you know, and it's difficult. So it's not necessarily that my cultural background influences me. I think that everybody brings values to the table, include your family experiences. That is kind of part of the decision-making process. It would be very hard for us to consciously identify at what point our culture is influencing a decision. And I think that would be hard for anybody. What I can say is that I am very appreciative of the values of our Constitution, and those are not easy to uphold. Being a judge or being a citizen of this country is hard if you want to do it right, because you have to be willing to essentially uphold the right of somebody to say something that you completely disagree with or abhor. You have to be willing to say, I don't care how heinous the crime is that you've committed, you are entitled to be presumed innocent and entitled to have people prove that crime against you. And these values are difficult. So I think from a cultural perspective, the things that bring me to this are, again, my lived experiences. And I think that those experiences are important because you might take a different look at some other things that are happening.
So I agree with Judge Galvan that it's more than just the cultural background, but our individual life experiences. I would like to share just something that I did when I was doing dependencies. Dependencies, for those of you who don't know, is when CPS gets involved and take children away. And one of the things that we had on our calendar on Fridays was a motion to have a special immigrant status for a juvenile. And so typically I would see kids that were between the ages of 16 and 20, 19, from all over, from Honduras, from Guatemala, from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Colombia, that were just before me seeking that petition so that it could help them with their immigration status. And I made it a point every time that I had, and they always spoke with an interpreter. And of course, I spoke in English through the interpreter. But I always made a point to make sure that the kids and the caregivers knew that I spoke Spanish and that I knew something about their culture. So for example, if I had a kid from Honduras, I would ask him, do you like to cook pupusas? What's your favorite pupusa? And they would be like, oh. Or when somebody would say in the report, and so likes to play soccer, I would say, ay, so juegas fútbol, so that they knew, so that they felt comfortable. And so I would have that connection with them. And I do want to address Lillian's question, but I don't know if Judge Diaz, you want to answer that first question. I don't want to jump ahead.
No, I agree entirely where Judge Galvan started with, which is we follow the law, right? No different than other judges. But I would ask to consider, what is culture, and and what are we referring to as judicial decision making? Culture means, like I was hoping to convey, is lots of different layers there, right? It can be language, It can be economics, it can be religion, it can be general sociology, it can be approaches to mental health and, or gender issues. Lots of different things are involved in culture. And we make lots of different kinds of decisions, on a complex civil case involving, say, a wage and labor dispute. Maybe my cultural background has no influence on that. It's just a purely theoretical and intellectual exercise that I'm engaged in. In other ways, if Judge Rajul and her experience in dependency is similar to my experience in juvenile over the last few years, which is sometimes the cultural background really does impact things. Like I can understand the Spanish speakers. I understand what they're saying. Sometimes interpreters get it wrong a little bit, and I obnoxiously try to correct them, and things like that. So it does influence. So it really varies, and there are times where they have no effect. There are times where they have a lot of effect. So that's all I was going to say. So Judge Rajul, if you wanted to, there are a few questions now. There are a few questions in the chat. Did you want to start with the Lillian?
I was going to answer Lillian's question of the issue of Hispanic and Latin. And actually, when I was in law school, we used to have the Hispanic Bar Association. And when I was in law school, it switched to the Latino Bar Association. And part of it is with the Latin term, we want to, it's more inclusive of Latin American people. Hispanic covers more, includes the Spaniards, for example. And so I think that's one of the main differences. But I personally identify as both because my dad was from Spain. And I actually used to be able to go to Spain, and I celebrated Christmas like Judge Diaz, New Year's Eve. And I also celebrated Dia de los Magos, which is January 6th, which is when the wise men bring presents to the baby. So I have both the Hispanic and the Latin. I grew up in Colombia, so from that perspective, I am Latina, but my dad was from Spain and I am half Spanish, and so I am Hispanic.
I identify as Latina or Chicana, having grown up here in the United States. My aunt, if any of you are interested, is currently on a Netflix special called 9 to 5. Rosalinda Aguirre, who's a labor activist and was working with Dolores and Cesar when I was but a child. So I grew up in that movement, in that arena. So but I also grew up in Mexico. So I definitely identify as Mexicana, and I could probably sing for you most mariachi songs. So if you give me a mariachi, I'll start singing. That's how you can tell I'm a Mexicana. So that's how I identify. And I, but I've often also stated that I also understand and am sad that my own indigenous roots are lost to me. I tell people I speak two languages, the language of my conquerors and the language of my colonizers. I leave you to decide which one is which. But there is a wonderful, obviously, indigenous heritage that I feel that I don't have a hold of, and that's something that I'm certainly exploring as well. So I want to acknowledge that, as we acknowledge that all of us are on indigenous land as well.
Yep. And for my part, I also identify as Latino. I remember when I was in college, there was a big spirited debate about what the Hispanic Students Association at my college would be called going forward. And again, it's, for me, there's a lot of nuance here, and I want to pick up where Judge Galván left off, which is, so my parents did the 23andMe, the DNA deal where you pinprick or saliva swab or something, and you ship it off, and then you get it back, and they were both 75% indigenous, so native South American, and 25% just a hodgepodge. A good amount in Spain, but also other random places, all over the world. And so I definitely there's a complexity, and then there's an ignorance there for me that I don't know what I am. Like, my grandparents were from all over Peru. My grandmothers were from up in the mountains in the central Peruvian highlands, and from two small towns. They kind of looked traditionally indigenous. My two grandfathers were from cities, not Lima, one Trujillo, the other Cajamarca, up north in Peru. They looked more kind of European-y, kind of standard, stereotypical European-y. And so, but I can't go back any farther than that. I mean, there are no records. I mean, my grandma doesn't really, she never knew when the day of her birth. It was registered in some church and the church burned down. So she doesn't know. And so there's a lot of ignorance on my part about what exactly, where it goes back. But I guess that's a long story for just saying generically Latino is how I identify. I think we have a couple more minutes for a couple more questions. One from Jeanette. What is your advice for new lawyers, attorneys, or people who work in the legal field? Judge Galván, did you want to take that one on first?
And I'll say hello to Jeanette. She is also a mentee of mine. And I'm glad to see you're here. Reach out. If there's something that interests you, I think that you're going to find that so many judicial officers and so many lawyers are always happy to hear from people who have an interest in their field, and they're always happy to talk about it. So if you have an interest, reach out to somebody and let them know that you're interested, and I'm sure that you'll find people respond. Do what you're passionate about doing. And remember that right now, I love the work that I do, but a lot of the work that I do outside or off the bench is really what feeds my soul, whether it's teaching law students or going to speak to high schools or as co-chair of the Minority and Justice Commission. All of that work that I engage in really feeds my soul, because I not only get to work in the system, but I get to look outside of it and hopefully try to change it. So those committees, those commissions, all of that work matters. So if you're passionate about this work, it's not just the day in and day out practice. It's also going to be the stuff that you do outside of that despacho. It's going to be the stuff you do outside of your office, and the work that you engage in systemically to try to make it better for everyone. And the work that I do, I know I'm not going to see fruits of in my generation, but I'm hoping to see it in the future. And I always say that the position that I hold right now is held in trust. It's not mine. I'm just warming the seat until somebody else comes along. And I hope to leave it in a better position than I found it. Thank you.
Judge Rajul, did you want to take on the next question again in the interest of time? I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A.
I just said thank you, Judge Diaz, for reminding me that the purple month is the day of Señor de los Milagros. I didn't see another question.
No,
Judge Rajul, sorry, Judge Diaz. The other questions I can read it to you. Are there any books, community events, or resources you will recommend for anyone who may not be Latinx to learn more and grow their scope?
And I guess the question, are you talking about, when you're asking about books, community events, resources in general for attorneys, or I guess I'm not understanding the question, the specific question.
I believe it's meant for in general, not just necessarily attorneys. Resources that you recommend for anyone who may not be Latino to learn more and grow their scope.
I think, Gina, I have a list of books that I'll share with you offline. She works in Kent, so I'm happy to share some of those. But I have a lot of books, obviously, from the 70s. So I'm happy to share those with anybody who's interested.
Great. And Judge Rajul, do you want to take on the next question then?
Do you ever get the impression that our gente expects more compassion or leniency due to the fact that we may look the same or may identify the same culturally? I don't know, but and then it says, I have experienced times when I think I was perceived as a traitor to people of our race when I have to enforce the rules or laws. I will tell you, as I said earlier, one of the reasons I wanted to be a prosecutor is because I felt that it was important to have the Latinos, not just with the defense bar, but also with the state. And I was very vocal about that. And my very first trial as a brand new deputy was a DUI and the defendant was Colombian, not just Latino, he was Colombian. And I remember, and I felt so guilty almost. And I remember when the verdict was coming in, he said to me in Spanish, "How about our country yesterday?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "We beat Argentina or whatever in some football game." And I was like, oh, and I felt bad, but at the same time, I knew that my role as a prosecutor, and I don't know that he expected any treatment. I don't know. I don't think he did. It was just awkward because it was my first trial, and I was doing exactly what I thought I was going to be doing: have the Spanish-speaking prosecutor at the table.
Folks, I want to apologize, but I do have to step aside. Thank you all for this opportunity. And I do invite anybody who my contact information is out there. Please, if you have any questions, or please feel free to reach out. Thank you, Judge Diaz. Thank you, Judge Rajul.
Thank you all. I also have to go get ready for the afternoon. So thank you so much, Yvonne and Beth and others on the committee for organizing all this. And thank you all for participating. Thanks, Judge.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.